Let's get started. New to the city forum, Madison, and this is the last city forum of 2016, so thank you for joining us. I'm going to take a moment to make a plug for the Planning Forum Journal, which there's 200 copies in the back. Those are for you. Please take a copy as you go. So this is a student journal that has been reinvigorated and given new life. It's present and it's ongoing. So please get a copy. And then I'd like, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our final speaker, save the best for last for 2016. Council Member Greg Casar. Just a little background, those of you that are not familiar with some of his background. He's a native Texan, son of Mexican immigrants, was elected to represent District 4 in 2014. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia. Served as policy director for the Workers' Defense Project. Has the distinction of being the youngest city council member in the history of Austin, I believe. At least upon taking office.
Yeah, I found out the day I took office.
Yeah, and in 2015 was elected by the Austin Chronicle readers as the best elected city official in Austin. And is well known as a champion of social justice, environmental stewardship. And today's talk actually is dealing with fighting for fair housing in Austin. So please join me in thanking Councilmember Casar for joining us today.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you all so much. I heard that y'all actually have some democratic process in which you invite people, which makes me feel really honored and humbled to wherever it is that I fell on the list, that I was high up enough to be able to join y'all today. So it's fun to be able to get out of City Hall and to come up and to be with just folks out in the community, and especially with students and people associated with the university. As the doc mentioned, I was elected as a young person, and a lot of folks were concerned about, well, how are you going to do this as a young person? And a big part of the answer was really dedicated young folks that went out and knocked on tons of doors and ate tons of pizza and drank beer to enter data in exchange. And so it's nice to sort of come back to the home base of people who are really thoughtful and thinking about how we deal with ongoing and long-standing issues in our city. I ran as somebody that had been a workers' rights organizer and an immigrants' rights organizer, and really interested in those core issues. And those are still many of the issues that I am very concerned about and work on. But the issue of Austin being such a segregated metropolis, the affordable housing crisis that we're in, and the urban planning context that exacerbates that became an unavoidable issue. And that if I wanted to have some level of intellectual integrity, and I think if most of us on the Austin City Council and in other positions of power in Austin want to think about what we can control and what we can make better in our city, it's almost unavoidable to just stick in the world of workers' rights or immigrants' rights without thinking about where people are going to live, because housing can determine whether or not you are a part of our city in the very first place. So no matter how much I and others cared about providing great health and human services, those health services and public health services can only be available if you are able to live within Austin. No matter how much I cared about bringing park space to my district, which is the most parks deficient area in the entire city, it didn't make a lot of sense to have the best park system or the best policing system or the best firefighting in Texas, for example, if people aren't even able to afford to have those services. And that's becoming more and more of the existing reality for Austinites. And it seems that the status quo is really unacceptable. And the question is, where is it that we go from here? So I'm going to just talk for a short while. I think my goal is to only talk for maybe 20 minutes so that I can answer as many of y'all's questions as possible. To start off, I want to describe for y'all an experience that was really defining for me. In the first few weeks of being sworn into office, Richard Florida, put out his ranking of economically segregated metros, and Austin came out right on the top. And parts of my district, which are in north central Austin, starting basically at 51st Street, just north of the Mueller development, and running up north through the Highland Mall, St. John's, Runberg, up to Breaker Lane, actually has some of the remaining affordable housing in the city, and actually some wonderfully economically and racially integrated neighborhoods, but we see a lot of that rapidly disappearing. So right around the same time that that ranking came out, I got a phone call on my office phone. It was pretty late in the evening, so most of my staff had left, and I answered the phone, and it was some constituents that wanted to put me on the phone with one of their friends from their PTA at one of our most integrated elementary schools in all of Austin. And I got on the phone and was speaking with a constituent I'd never met before named Leilani, and she lived in an apartment complex where everybody was on month-to-month rent, had recently gotten a new coat of paint slapped onto it. The lines in the parking lot had gotten sort of a brighter yellow on them. The name changed, and all of a sudden their rent almost doubled overnight. And they basically were given a month to figure it out. She has 2 kids in the elementary school and asked for what kind of help that I could provide. She was sort of just on the brink of saying, we're going to wind up homeless. We don't know where it is that we're going to go. We don't know what school my kids are going to wind up in. And so I spent a lot of that evening and the next day calling nonprofits, trying to figure out what city resources were available, doing everything that I could to try to connect her with some services so that she in particular, but probably the other 50 families or so in this apartment complex wouldn't wind up on the street. I got her phone number, her contact info, got some resources together over the course of a couple days, tried calling her, couldn't get in touch, didn't actually talk to her again until maybe 4 or 5 days later. And by then she said that she had already left, already been essentially kicked out, and was staying on the floor with her kids at her sister's apartment further up north in my district. And so you can imagine that that's a pretty some cold water splashed on your head sort of within the first little while of trying to be a responsible elected official that's responsive and helpful to the concerns of my constituents. And on a one-on-one level, I felt like that was some level of failure, but what was even worse is thinking about that her story is really representative of the stories of thousands of people within a really prosperous area. There's lots of great things happening in Austin, but thankfully somebody that I knew that had access to her was able to connect with me, and even in that situation, there wasn't much that I could do about it. So we being sort of global thinkers know that she's representative of a much broader problem happening in the city. And I myself, my better half, she's a social worker, and she always talks about how she likes to process stuff, and I always try to jump to solutions. And this is a relationship issue, but it's also, so you understand my head a little bit, is that the next thing that I start thinking about, and as I'm sure many of y'all think about, is, well, what do we do about that? Not just for her and the direct services set of things, but what could we have done to prevent that long term? And what do we do, given our growth and prosperity, to channel some of the good things that we have in order to prevent these things from continuing to happen at a large scale and continue to exacerbate the segregation, the fair housing issues, and the unaffordability within our city? What powers and tools do we have? And I know that probably lots of y'all, since you're smart folks, you got into school, probably study this stuff way longer than I have, probably have some preferred ideas and preferred solutions, as do lots of the political actors and activists at City Hall. For some people, they jump first to the idea of insufficient housing supply inside of the urban core of Austin generally, who think about first and foremost, if there were other places for some of those higher income renters to move into, maybe they would not have priced out Leilani from some older classy apartments. But others of you and other folks think first about, in lots of places across the country and across the globe, there's government intervention to buy up or subsidize those older apartments so they get rehabilitated and locked in at lower rents, so that the landlords have some sort of deal where folks don't actually get priced out. Or others of you who may think about, old apartments aren't always worth saving that were built in a suburban style long before now, and what we need to be able to do is to generate affordable units that are new and livable, and generate some of our prosperity into building those, so that if Leilani got kicked out of one, maybe she could actually move into somewhere better. Or that we should be buying up land and socializing the housing market more, where the government actually has sort of a public option. And what I would postulate to y'all is that the really interesting thing is that oftentimes in Austin we fight about between option A, B, C, D, and E, instead of thinking about the fact that all sorts of good-hearted people have ideas that all probably need to be employed, and that we need to start bringing an all of the above approach to dealing with our fair housing issues and our lack of affordable housing. And I think things have started to get bad enough that all sorts of people across the city have thought about how is it that we rewrite our land development codes, rewrite our city budgets, rethink how we deal with urban planning, rethink about the government's role in housing, and bring that sort of all of the above approach to engaging in the housing market. And so that's part of what I've got up here on the board, which is something I'm going to go through here in a minute, is some of the work that we've started to do on the city council level. But before I get into that, I think it's also important to acknowledge that if this was really so easy, then why wouldn't it have happened otherwise? And that's where the work of politics is. That's where probably some of this Q&A I would encourage it to go, because the fact of the matter is, if it was easy, then good-hearted people would have just figured out and gone ahead and done it. But the fact of the matter is, there are real trade-offs involved with that. There are real trade-offs involved with rerouting budget dollars away from services like parks or libraries or policing or keeping the stability of the electric or water utility over into housing. And there has to be the political will to acknowledge things, like I said earlier in the talk, that what's the point of having the absolute best park system or the absolute best policing system in the state if you have to be able to pay and have a certain level of income and education in order to access those services. But that's hard because you have people who really care about each of those things, as do I. There's also, a long-standing sense of us being a sort of sleepier college town with larger amounts of land per household unit. And that works for a while until you start running out of space, and higher income people in a world of global capital are those that get to pick which space they live in. I don't know many homeless rich folks, but I do know lots of folks with lower incomes that wind up in that situation. So how do we all fit, and how do we rethink our urban planning paradigm to fit in that? But then at the same time, if you start thinking about redeveloping the urban core, you have issues of gentrification, you have issues of older housing stock being torn down in order to add housing stock. But if we don't do that, then there's the alternative of paralysis and not adding housing stock and old houses getting really expensive anyways. You probably need to start, and I think where a lot of places the city is trying to start with is, what is the low-hanging fruit? How do we capture some of that additional property tax revenue long before it gets in the parks departments or the police department's hand? How do we think about parking? I mean, a lot of us in a lot of parts of the city require lots and lots of spaces for cars. And if we can't turn spaces for cars into places for people, then I think we're probably doomed in the first place. And so there's that political work that's necessary to be done. And so there needs to be the pairing of good ideas, sort of some humility towards, in my view, an all of the above approach, and then the political organizing being done both by students and professionals and tenants and good-hearted people all over the city to address the issue. And so that's what I'm hoping that I can maybe be a part of, and hopefully y'all, after this talk, if you're not already, can be a part of too. So I do want to go into my last few minutes here before going into Q&A, just into some of the work that has been passed at the City Council. One bundle of it has been part of a resolution that Council Member Pio Renteria, who represents District 3, sort of some parts of traditional East Austin and Southeast Austin, who's the chair of our Housing Committee, and myself worked on and was passed by a large majority of the City Council. So we called it the Austin Fair Housing Initiative, has 4 general parts in it. One is thinking about creating a larger public investment and public role in housing. We traditionally pass affordable housing bonds. That is, we take out debt authorized by Austin's voters to add a little bit of additional property tax levy in order to finance affordable housing. But sometimes those elections go down, and frankly, we've been asking, in my view, for a little bit too little of money compared to the overall problem. So we're thinking more about how is it that we dedicate just greater funding streams to housing, and I'll go into some of that. We've been talking about more mixed income developments. In lots of parts of the country, you've got inclusionary zoning regimes, and thinking more about how we generate more mixed income buildings within the city is really important to us. And then also thinking about combating gentrification, not just putting affordable housing units in high opportunity areas where there's more development, but also how we start planning for the next frontiers of gentrification, because frankly, the East Side has changed so rapidly, but we're not quite thinking yet about what's going to happen in Dove Springs or what's going to happen in Runberg neighborhoods. We're thinking about utilizing more of our zoning authority to help people stay in their neighborhoods and stay in place, because frankly, for a lot of intergenerational families, who've owned their homes and their land for a long time, they've accumulated a lot of wealth in this boom in their assets, right? You bought a house for $50,000 and now you can sell it for $500,000. That could be a good thing for your family, but the question is, where would you go? And we have essentially set folks up with the answer of where you would go is nowhere near where you grew up or where you have social connections. And so how can we help people think about how to utilize that asset and that wealth to stay on their lot or within their neighborhood, given that we don't have that option for people right now. And then also thinking about diversities of housing types and smaller housing options in those high opportunity areas, because there are so many families within my own district who would be welcoming of having a different housing type or a smaller amount of space for them to live in exchange for being able to send their kids to a different school or to be able to be in a part of town that's closer to their work. And we really don't have very many of those options right now. And what's interesting, again, about this sort of setup is that there are broad coalitions of folks who are generally interested in housing or interested in city politics, who feel really strongly about one of the four, okay with one or two of them, and kind of uncomfortable about a fourth. But as long as people are uncomfortable but not outraged, then that's what coalition building really is. Professor Spellman, who I never actually got to take as a professor because I'm not a Longhorn, but whose office I sit in, said, if you reach mutual begrudging acquiescence, then you've done your job as a city council member, as long as everybody just dislikes you a little bit. And so I kind of try to go for that. It's not the best thing to do in politics. I got told early on, don't mess with cabs or zoning and you'll be okay. And we've gotten very much involved in both. But I think it's ultimately the question that falls before us. And if people aren't a little bit unhappy, then you probably didn't try hard enough. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag based on housing strategies, but it's what we're trying to employ. So talking about mixed income developments, we are generally precluded by state law from doing inclusionary zoning like they do in other parts of the country, but there is some state legislation that does allow us in certain parts of the city to try out inclusionary zoning in a mandatory fashion, where it's not an option for the developer, but you actually set up a requirement that you're going to have some affordable units mixed into your development in particular areas. So that will have some interesting legal ramifications, and it'll be kind of a new frontier for our city. We also passed a directive to the city manager to look into rethinking our density bonus programs. And I don't know how much y'all know about that, but essentially, if in lots of parts of our city you can build a building of a certain height and size and a certain amount of parking, but the city will give you a little bit of extra. We'll give you a little bit more entitlement, a few extra stories in exchange for below market rate units being reserved for people that are making less money inside of that building. But oftentimes people don't actually utilize the extra stories because we're not exactly calibrated to the market, or lots of people are taking advantage of it because we aren't asking for enough. And so we are sort of looking at some consultants to help us best calibrate those programs so that we get the best bang for our buck. And y'all, the most obvious one is here in the West Campus area, where you've seen all these high rises pop up recently. And I believe a lot of experts who've gone back and analyzed that have seen a pretty dramatic shift in demographics in West Campus that have allowed students of a higher variety of incomes than we otherwise would have expected, and racial and ethnic backgrounds than we otherwise would have expected to live in West Campus. So a lot of us outside of the West Campus areas look at it and feel like it's some glitzy, glamorous thing where only really high-income students are allowed to live. But thanks to some of these density bonus programs, y'all know there's lots of units where you have to provide your FAFSA in order to be able to live in them. I know it's not always the best enforced program, and we got to figure out the best way to make sure that our programs are doing what we said they would. But we're working on making them more effective. And then we finally have tried passing citywide protections for people that use housing vouchers and Section 8 vouchers when they are trying to live in an apartment. Because oftentimes you'll find that there are people who have a Section 8 voucher, but landlords won't rent to them. And so the city passed a ban on that kind of discrimination citywide. The Apartment Association and others went to the legislature and preempted us. And so now we're trying to figure out within other city programs can we enact that ban on a smaller scale that won't be contrary to state law? So I know there's a lot there, but I'll let y'all ask questions on what's actually interesting to you. We are, as I talked about, we're working on more of a diversity of housing types and sizes. When I first came onto the city council, there had been an ongoing campaign to allow more garage apartments and granny flats in the city. Basically, the proposal was if you can build an extension to your house under existing city rules, you should be allowed to detach it and put a kitchen in it, and that should be okay. And so that didn't seem so off base to me. It was like Star Wars Episode 50. I mean, it was a huge fight, but it goes to sort of show how I think we have an inherent resistance to thinking about how it is that we provide different kinds of housing types in different kinds of neighborhoods. But we came out okay, and just in the last year, we've seen well over a doubling of the number of garage apartment options available in the city, which is really exciting. And so we're thinking about how we continue to think to bring those missing middle housing types to Austin. As far as a larger public investment, we are primarily bringing a lot more money directly into our affordable housing fund by ensuring that new money coming in from formerly publicly owned pieces of land, y'all may that tax revenue, when it is developed, goes directly into the affordable housing fund. And so y'all may know that there is an old water treatment plant that used to be downtown not too long ago. The Seaholm Power Plant is downtown. It's not so fashionable to have your water treatment plant and your electric plant in the middle of your downtown anymore. And so those are being privately developed on 99-year leases with the city. And we are directing all of that property tax revenue directly into the affordable housing fund, along with other formerly state-owned sites where the state of Texas, because they want to say they're passing property tax cuts, are shelling out and selling their real estate assets. And that's kind of gimme revenue to the city, right? That's not revenue that we were anticipating. It's not revenue we necessarily need to plan on. And so why not send that to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund so that you don't have to have a whole battle at City Hall over carving money out of a variety of important city departments to put into affordable housing. And we are also contracting with a firm to look at affordable housing fees. So all over the city, if you're building a development, you have to pay a fee for water, you have to pay a fee to improve the street or improve the sidewalk, a fee for parks, a fee for trees you might uproot, but no fees for affordable housing. And so this is, again, a new sort of legal and legislative frontier for the city of Austin to start considering if we might have an affordable housing fee, especially linked to if you're creating high-wage jobs. Oftentimes that creates some low-wage jobs associated with it as well, creates people wanting to live near those jobs, and we probably need some affordable housing money in order to make the whole city and the whole system work. And so that's the foundation for why we'd be able to charge such a fee. It'll probably be in the news. And then finally, I think I talked about the stay-in-place work a decent bit, but the idea being that there are lots of people across the city, especially in some parts of my district, you've got people sort of in ranch-style, former white flight suburban-style housing, where grandma bought this house on 8,000 square feet, decades and decades ago for just $30,000 or $40,000 or less, and now she's sitting on all of this land and wants to stay in the neighborhood. And so how do we create opportunities for portions of that land to be developed so that she can capture some of that wealth to provide her grandkids or great-grandkids their college tuition, but not have to move to Pflugerville or Elgin or beyond. And so thinking about how we capitalize on how much land there is in the city and give people an option beyond pay really, really high property taxes on that asset or get out of here. There's really no in-between options. And so we're thinking about how we create those. And I'm right at the 30-minute mark. And so instead of providing some really thoughtful, wonderful conclusion, I would rather just hear y'all's questions and maybe I come up with that wonderful conclusion at the end. So thank y'all so much.
What role do you see that a new tenant union might be able to play in manifesting some of these goals you're talking about, given that the majority of people in Austin are renters, but the political participation of renters does not really seem to be there, except for you. Because my city council member seems to only think of affordability in terms of property taxes, and which renters can't, they pay the full amount without any deduction. So what could a tenant union do to kind of help with this stuff?
I had a feeling somebody would ask that question. That's why I didn't talk about it in the presentation. Tenant organizing is really important and lacking in the city. And so we're working I think that having sort of a broad-based association of tenant organizations is really important for Austin, and you have a lot of those in other cities in the country and all across the world. We've started, when I came into office, there was probably only 1 to 2 really active tenants associations in the whole city. And my district is over 70% renters, and that's not probably counting lots of undocumented people very well, so it's probably much higher than that. And so we immediately recognized that tenants issues were top of mind for our constituents. And I hired on a staff person that was basically a community organizer that I stole with taxpayer dollars to be paid better than most tenant organizers are paid. And he's a wonderful guy, and he went and helped organize some tenants associations within our district and some of the first neighborhood associations and mobile home parks that the city has ever seen, and got them linked up with attorneys, especially at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, to sue landlords that were doing things like raising rents in the middle of leases. And that sparked sort of a movement from the council to dedicate some resources to Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid to have a broader organizing project around tenants' rights, especially in respect to code enforcement, because a lot of lower income tenants, but not even just low income tenants, there were actually stories here around campus, are being taken advantage of by their landlords and not following the law. And I think since then, now we've got well over half a dozen active organizations. And that's leading me up to your broader question, which is, I think organizing and that is organizing work usually begins on your immediate conditions, right? You usually get started up as an association because they haven't fixed the air conditioning in 2 or 3 months, and that's what you're focused on, is getting the air conditioning fixed. And then next is getting management to change, and next is getting some sort of ongoing contract about how rent increases might work. So usually there's some period of time, 1 year, 2 years, where you really want to solidify an organization based on immediate community needs. But hopefully at some point, once we go beyond there being 7 or 8 folks, tenant associations with leadership that have really formalized what it is they need to do for their complex or their community, that we can start having that broader tenant union work where you start thinking about the broader issues related to tenants citywide. And I think that that's really important because oftentimes, the tenants issues are seen on sort of this case-by-case basis rather than what's good for tenants broadly. So I think that that's a critical need in the city to sort of bring in that voice, which is going to be diverse and may not line up with every single one of the priorities here, and that's a really good thing. And then tenant votership is also a really significant issue. So, I was not a politician too long ago, so I can sort of remember how it is that I thought before and how it is that I think now and how I try to hold on to things from before. But the fact of the matter is, who votes, who calls your office, who's raising a stink, who can call reporters, inherently is going to drag you towards particular positions and dedicate your time to certain things because you've got to keep your job for the long-term good of your job. And so I think, getting tenants and renters active in local politics and in voting is really important. And some of the problem there is just technological. So for those of y'all that are connected with folks that are interested in that kind of work, thinking about voter files and how you actually get out to voters is so much easier for on the home ownership front than on tenants who move around more. And so folks that can help crack that egg in many ways, I think, can unlock a lot of tenant power in places like Texas because technologically campaigns are really far behind on engaging tenants. And I think that hopefully as national resources start coming into Texas thinking about how we sort of rebuild votership here long term, that's a really important piece too. Yeah.
Actually, that leads into my question. So thinking about tenant power and tenants' rights, also taking kind of the legal context to which tenants are organizing ourselves, right? So the Building Strengthening Tenant Action Project, BASTA project, in particular, has been coming across this as a challenge. So Texas being a state where tenants have minimal legal protections. So even this being late or missing one rent payment is grounds, justifiable grounds to be evicted or to have your lease not renewed, basically. So One strategy for Boston in particular has been one program that was created through, I think, the second Affordable Housing Bond program, which is the Rental Housing Development Assistance RHGA program, right? So the tie there is that given that RHGA properties, which I think there are over 4,000 or about 4,000 affordable housing units through this program, there are subsidies, so that program investing into these properties are giving nonprofit and for-profit developers money to basically develop these properties in affordable housing units. The good thing about that is that with that money comes additional protections, and so like against arbitrary evictions and rent increases and things like that. So, but the thing though you kind of mentioned before is how do you actually, how do you administer it, and how do you actually monitor that program? Because actually some of those programs that have received funds have been big violators of tenant rights themselves. So cross departments, for example, has received a lot of money, and in District 4 as well. And so, and also a lot of times affordability levels kind of vary, and not necessarily the ones who need the most receive the majority of those units. So I was wondering, if you talk about kind of city responses to affordable housing, and also how that ties to or contradicts fair housing goals too, because a lot of times the RHA properties, and we've actually mapped them out. I think one person is in the program.
Oh yeah, these are all the evictions from
Yeah.
Cross Creek since it started receiving affordable $1,000 from the city. That's a book.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I'm glad you got that. I probably did.
Oh yeah.
Right, and it's like mapping them out. We found that a lot of them lie in very, very low opportunity areas, as you said before. So, kind of, what do you see kind of next steps to really?
I'm going to try to unpack your questions into a few parts.
Yeah.
So
It's like
the first part is just, there's the broad policy work that needs to be done by the council, right? And that feels really urgent. And then there's also the straight up city resources, bureaucratic processes to make sure that you don't just have to have citizens and legal organizations hounding particular developers or landlords to follow the rules that they signed up for in the first place. And it's really challenging for us to be doing both unless there is, pretty significant will to do both. And I think that actually goes back to your very question, which is, if the vast majority of the phone calls and the press and the work being done at City Hall, if the big headline when the budget passes isn't about what we're trying to do for tenants, but the fact that the property tax rate went down, but somebody's property tax bill still increased a little bit because the value of their asset went up so much, then you have this disconnect in priorities. Probably different from the priorities that you've laid out or that are most important to me. And so there's the political issue, to build the political will to be able to be doing all of these things at once. At once, it's irresponsible for us to not be thinking about broader reaching affordable housing policies, but at the same time, it's irresponsible to not be trying to fix the mechanisms to make the existing affordable housing programs work the way they were supposed to. And to be able to do both takes a lot of political will, a lot of time, a lot of leadership, and a lot of activists and people doing that work. And so part of this talk, and as many talks as I try to give, is a call to action to say we need as many people that think about these things and care about this to be involved, because otherwise other people will fill the vacuum and lead to other priorities, which is their right, of course, but it's your right as well. Thinking about, particulars like Cross Creek in this book, right? It shouldn't have to happen the way that it happens for me, where like in the middle of my Friday date night, I escape to the bathroom for a minute to call the owner and developer and yell at him on the phone and try to stop evictions, right? Like that's not how it should work, right? But that is currently a lot of the existing. That's what happens. That's how it works. And there's only so many phone calls you can make. You shouldn't have to have access to your city council member in order for that work to happen. And so there's really important activism that has to be done about enforcing and reforming our existing programs, long story short. And the third and last part is about this sort of dispersion of affordable housing, or just the straight up integration of our city. And we had a really horrible decision come down recently, from a variety of local actors, that I think exemplifies a lot of the issue. We have so little below market rate affordable housing and subsidized housing west of MOPAC. And we actually had a case before us where we finally were going to really subsidize units with 9% state tax credits and some Austin affordable housing money to build a bunch of low-income units with a workforce development center in the bottom of them next to Murchison Middle School, great in a great high opportunity neighborhood. And there's a state law that sort of ranks projects. And this project would have been tied for first or second place, so certainly would have received funding based on all of the criteria. But it had to get an Austin City Council affirmative zoning vote. And there's a law that says that if you get a petition of neighbors against a zoning change, you have to have a supermajority of the council. So somehow we had to get 9 council members to agree to a zoning change when you had hundreds of people with signs out in front of their yard saying no apartments. Now, it's not like this was zoned for single-family houses. This area was zoned for an industrial park. So essentially, people were saying, I prefer an industrial park here than to have neighbors that are making like 40 to 50% of Austin's MFI. So we're talking like people making $30,000 a year. And so that was really disheartening. But while we were building a political coalition to get that work done, there's also another law that says that if a state rep signs a letter supporting a project, it moves up in points. If they sign a letter opposing a project, it goes down in points. And if they don't sign a letter, it doesn't get points. Well, ultimately, a bunch of projects all over the state get no letter or a negative letter, and this project got no letter. And that bumped it down from tying for first or second place to being in 4th place, and 1st through 3rd place were all in Georgetown, so all of those state tax credits went to Georgetown, and none of them came here. And so that's the sort of mechanisms and moments that even in a progressive liberal Austin result in that kind of issue. And so then you have areas that are already zoned for multifamily, already zoned for affordable housing, where folks are already used to that, where you have state reps that are already supportive of that, and you see that funneling. And then also obviously in a hot real estate market, if you're trying to get as many units on the ground as you can to save as many Leilani's from being homeless as you can, you've got that inherent tension of how do I get the most bang for my buck without paving over the aquifer, without having to do too many zoning changes, without having to pay way too much money when you have limited resources. So all of those things combined, and you wind up where we're at.
Okay, 1 and 2.
So, just a quick question. Speaking of zoning, where is the code next process now as far as the council sees? Because that could just be a huge opportunity to open up the city to more type of development and more types of.
Yeah. So we have not done a comprehensive rewrite of our land development code in decades. And so we're doing a full rewrite of all of our land development rules called Code Next. And some people have called it Code Never because it feels like it's been going on for years and years and years. But now it's finally code with a schedule. And so just recently, we actually put a goal of that entire process going through a community input procedure. That's kind of what I call it, surgical community input procedure, all through next year. And I believe that we will survive the procedure. And so that will be put out on the streets, a draft of what it is that we plan to implement will be put out on the street at the end of January, beginning of February. And then we need as much advocacy to refine it, improve it, support it, do that kind of work all the way from February through November when we're planning on it hitting the council's desk. And actually our planning commission and zoning and plating commissions, which are appointed by the Austin City Council, will be taking some votes a few months earlier than that. And so there needs to be advocacy around those points, all with the goal of getting it passed entirely, because we have to vote on it 3 separate times because it's an ordinance and it's also the zoning map for the entire city, before election season gets started a year and a half from today. So this year and a half process is really critical for doing that work. And in many ways, you can read up on it. Our existing land development code, does not, really lends itself to Capital Metro not having a good time in the city. Really hurts our transit opportunities, is sending lots and lots of sprawl out into outlying areas, which hurts our fiscal health as well as the environment out there. And then finally, obviously, constrains our housing options and further segregates the town. And so really critical work to be done there and needs as much advocacy as possible.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us, Council Member Casar. So I worked with Devin on this project on rental housing development assistance programs throughout the semester. It took 4 of us to sort of dig deep into the web of neighborhood housing, code department, and then the county's precinct courts, right, where evictions take place.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking there's 3 places where a tenant would fall through the cracks here, right? Because it's neighborhood housing's dollars, they're administering the go bond dollars, and have written in this contract that supposedly has tenant protections, but then when I met with the interim director of code, Cora Wright, she didn't know that RHDA existed, she was unaware of it. And NHCD purportedly does these inspections at these properties, which hasn't been happening, as I'm sure you're aware. And then if I'm a tenant and I call 311 with a complaint, I get routed to code. Code's not aware that I'm living in an RHDA property, and I don't think that NHCD is looking at code's complaints, right? And we know there's multiple complaints at these properties. We researched all of them since their affordability cert periods. But then I get sick of it. There's no response, there's open unresolved complaints from code. I stop paying my rent potentially, right? And then I get evicted. And JP Court doesn't know that there's RHDA agreements. So I'm just thinking, I think that there's some really good momentum right now with tenant organizing, but there's a really good opportunity because we have an interim city council member, we have an interim NHCD director, as I understand, and an interim code director. Whomever is hired into those 3 positions could be a real opportunity for change, for more cohesive city work. I don't know what your thoughts are, and I hate to put you on the spot because Cross Creek is in your district, and it's clearly been a malevolent actor for quite some time. I don't know what the solution is here. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, there's been significant issues within the city's own code enforcement department and neighborhood housing department where folks have retired, but it's really, there's new, basically they need new leadership. And our city manager had moved on after an extended period of time, and so we have big openings in each of those departments. And I think that it's really important as the city searches for who's going to lead up that work, for them to hear what the priorities of the community are. Right now we're just basically at a place where they're cleaning up really public scandals of harassment within our housing department, right? And so figuring out just how to get that to work is kind of the interim person's task. But thinking about housing being such a key issue for Austin, we should be getting some national, be doing a national search and getting hopefully a national hero and champion to lead that department. And I think that it's incumbent on us and tenant organizers and folks that care about these sorts of issues to be engaged in whatever public process there is to search for that person so that they know that this needs to be high on their list. Because we've got a city manager and city council form of government where I try not to get into the operations and day-to-day work, even though sometimes we have to. And so figuring out, how the 311 call takers are actually trained to do this, to call this person, to make it all work, is not a part of the city council's work, but it is a part of what the public can help us on. Because the city council member can eventually go get in there and start doing that, but we're not really well equipped to do it. It can become a vortex and suck on your time, and then all this other work falls off the map. And so I would encourage you and others who are interested in that, it really only takes a handful of people to make really significant change in local government. I mean, it really takes just a few people with an idea, and it's incredible because it's small enough that you don't have the Koch brothers dumping a bunch of money on you fighting you. I personally had a friend who was booked into the Travis County Jail 3 years ago, and I went to go visit him, and I realized that I asked how I could see him personally because I'm somebody that was concerned for his health and wanted to make sure that he looked okay. And they said that I couldn't see him, that I had to use this phone and a screen to telesee him, and that seemed really wrong to me. And so I called up some people that I knew at the county, happened to know the person that was running the campaign for the Travis County judge. She had no idea that had been going on and that the sheriff had just totally gotten rid of in-person visitation and set up phone visitation. And a group of 3 or 4 people got together and met, and really it was a group of that grew into a group of a dozen folks that eventually created the momentum for there to be a statewide ban on that kind of stuff in the state. Because even Republican state legislators said that seems kind of against the law about visitation, that all of a sudden you're calling screening visitation. And that's just a small example of how when you've got something that's just operational and kind of common sense like that, just a small dedicated group of people can really make a shift.
So we know that HUD is gonna be shaken up pretty bad. And of course, under Ben Carson, one thing that I think most people are quite certain is, under Secretary Ben Carson, would be that the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule will go away. We're still not sure if most of that data and the tools that came with it will go away. Is the city considering having something like the affirmatively furthering fair housing at the local level? Of course, we cannot change what's gonna happen, but can we have that tied to maybe our bond properties or our home fund properties?
It's I think we're trying to insert it as a core value of the city's comprehensive plan and try to make it something that's as legally binding upon ourselves as state actors as possible and as others, to try to make sure that we're dispersing fair housing and getting people to integrate the city and follow whatever rules we can. I think that there was a bit of a benefit to being able to say, it's not just because Greg said it or the council said it, but also HUD may come after you. And now we don't have that tool. But I think that in this climate where, I'm a politician, so I have very political thoughts where, there are only 5 states where you've got a even Democratic to progressive governor and sort of progressive people who think about affirmatively furthering fair housing dominating both chambers of state government, and 25 states where that's the case for Republicans and folks who generally don't focus as much on that particular issue. It's really going to start coming down to cities more and more to do fair housing work and all sorts of other work that's progressive on immigration or workers' rights or anything else. And so I think that you're going to start seeing cities across the country trying to pair up with people that care to figure out where the borderline is. Where are we allowed to go further than the state allows, or maybe create a conflict with the federal government and with federal HUD saying, no, now we're going to enforce this even if it's coming in on your territory. And I think that you're going to start seeing, in my view, kind of the crazy alter ego of what you might have seen in the 60s, where you had massive resistance of local governments against school integration, where now you will hopefully see massive resistance from cities trying to push integration and trying to push progressive policies, even if they come in conflict with federal mandates and federal rules. So you're seeing this interesting flip on its head where local control and home rule cities in Texas were created because of racist politics. And now in response to racist politics coming from higher levels of government, people trying to utilize that local control in that home rule city to be anti-racist. And so I think that's going to be an interesting time for us.
Council Member Casar said you had a 1 o'clock meeting you had next, so we have.
I can stick around just before 1.
Okay, so
Yeah,
probably time for
and then
two
just
more.
jog a little bit.
Let's do someone that haven't done Dr. Odin, and then.
Yeah, I'm wondering what the conversation in the Fair Housing Initiative is around the cooperative housing and community land trusts as kind of alternative forms of housing that aren't renting and aren't single-family home ownership. And by cooperative housing, I mean more than just a stereotype of student co-housing, but really the financial structures that empower lower-income people to have some equity building, but also live in a more stable living situation. This is a project that I was a part of this semester as well. And it's just been really interesting seeing the initiatives, kind of like you're saying, cities taking the initiative in other parts of the country to provide funding and provide incentives to create cooperative housing or to create laws that allow tenants to buy their buildings and convert them into cooperatives. This is something that's been happening in Madison, Wisconsin, and New York City. And it can be a really interesting way, I found, of providing affordable housing in the long term, rather than kind of subsidizing it over many years and providing kind of a capital expense up front. So I'm kind of wondering if that's something that's been on the radar in conversations beyond tenants, right?
Yeah, we're definitely getting some of that kicked off, especially because we recognize that land is the most valuable part of this whole equation. And in many ways, what we just discussed is a whole battle for land and for power in your home. And so the second mobile home park that we organized, we're actually working with a group called ROC, which has a financial arm to try to help those mobile home residents purchase their property, potentially with some assistance to be paid back from the city, and run it as sort of a mobile home co-op. The Austin Independent School District is actually starting to shed off some surplus property, and I think there may be some really interesting ideas for the city to partner with the school district to have community land trusts for long-term affordable home ownership, or also for cooperatives and things like old school buildings, is something that I'm really interested in. And I think it's going to take probably and hopefully some particularly co-op organized work to advocate for more cooperative housing. I think like the folks at La Reunion Co-op, which y'all may be familiar with, which is sort of like a very mixed type co-op, is starting to do some of that advocacy work, and we need to have more of it. So, because just like any political institution, it takes a little while to steer the ship and to get used to new things. So you sometimes have to have people say the word co-op to you like 100 times, and for it to be in newspaper articles 40 or 50 times for you to feel comfortable starting to head that direction. And so, but I think that there is a pretty broad consensus and coalition on council that likes the idea of going there. And as far as rules and regulations that some of those cities and blue states have, I think that I'm really interested in figuring out which are the particular fights that we pick and which ones do we have the most chance of winning in court, or at least winning in the court of public opinion. And so, I think a lot of us are, especially given the climate we're headed into this year, really ready and willing to push the envelope and try to push things that maybe will hold up or maybe won't hold up in a red state, but why not try? Because it's kind of like, what is there to lose at this point? And so, really, I think those two things fit together. We need sort of more organized advocacy on the co-op front, and I think you've got fertile ground. And then probably on the legal side, we need to just decide where we're going to pick the fight.
I was just wondering, the homestead preservation districts, and I think the council, there's 4 of them now, something. Those seem to be like really potentially powerful tools that have a kind of a tax increment or value capture element. As you suggested, they may have inclusionary zoning capabilities and so on. But I haven't heard much about action in the approved homestead preservation. Could you just kind of update us? Because it seems like that would be a way to really reinvest in affordable housing in kind of specific core neighborhoods. Could be even extended corridors, whatever. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on?
So, homestead preservation districts and this publicly owned land are part of interesting mechanisms to capture prosperity and capture tax increments, capture new taxes being collected, and putting them into affordable housing well before you have to fight other city priorities in order to get them. And so we recognize sort of Central East Austin as our first homestead preservation district, where there's a lot of increased property value, and we actually said that 10% of that property value will immediately go into a fund to be respent into affordable housing in that area. And this past fiscal year was the first time that money was collected into a pot for it. But given some of the challenges at the housing department, I think there's still some stalling on strategically how that money can best be spent. But I think that pretty soon we're interested in figuring out if we can raise the amount of money captured there. But then also this publicly owned land, which is actually where more money is coming in, is also being funneled, about half of it, to helping do anti-gentrification work in those homestead preservation districts. Again, there is some stalling operationally on how that can best be done, but I think it's a powerful tool. The last piece that I think you'll be hearing about soon is that the city just got approved for $720 million worth of bonds to redo some of our major transportation arterials. And, a lot of folks have asked me, Runberg and Lamar, for example, is this area where you've got a lot of below market rate housing. If you've got a lot of lower income people who are living at this horribly dangerous intersection, lots of pedestrians being hit by cars, lots of cars hitting other cars. It's really not an acceptable situation for the city to be having people living in. But at the same time, if you go in and fix that up, how do you make sure that lower income folks can still live there if you make it better? And I think that this tax increment strategy is something you're going to see us employ, where we say we're going to improve the streets, but we know that that improvement of the street is going to raise property values around it. And instead of that money being sucked up and being spent all over the city, we're going to reinvest it to try to build affordability into that package. So I think, short answer to your question is that I think that that's exactly where we're headed. There's some operational stuff that probably has to get sorted out. And I think the funding strategy takes a few years for that new money to all sort of be put in a pot so that it can best be spent. One challenge, though, is every given year, though, folks like to, you saw this year a little bit of a raiding of the affordable housing dedicated money to clog up other budget priorities. And so I think there needs to be a more dedicated organizing strategy during the budget, that people don't try to scrape some of the money away from affordable housing because they've got problems somewhere else. And I've tried to emphasize to our city manager to really put all the money we've designated to affordable housing into the affordable housing pot and not to clog up holes in other parts of the budget like our last city manager did with housing money. Does that answer most of your question?
Are you gonna poke the legislative cage of inclusionary zones?
I'm beyond poking. I'm beyond poking. I think that for a long time, we've had some successful strategies of ducking and covering from our legislature, saying, if we hide, maybe they'll only get beat up a little bit. But at this point, I think it's so full frontal that I think that the strategy is going to have to shift, and that's going to be a new feeling for the Travis County delegation and for city government to say, this is who we are. We're proud of being Austin. We're going to pass 50 things and see if you can only knock out 45 of them and we can hold on to 5. Because frankly, right, in the past, things like anti-immigrant policies, the business community has been good at stalling those, and Austin has just tried to keep quiet. But now when Bill O'Reilly's entire show and Megyn Kelly's entire show and the West Wing of the White House are all dedicated to fighting immigrants everywhere, it really doesn't matter what I do and winds up on the front page of the Statesman if it's on cable TV night after night. And so I think you're going to start, in the next few years, I think the next couple of legislative sessions I think will be really interesting because my gut is the posture of Austin has to change to a more aggressive one, given more aggressive tactics, not to an even more defensive one.
Thank you very much.
So I have to run, but for those of y'all who